Get straight into today's stories then, shall we? Now, Michael Gove says he's told pro-Palestine protesters they risk rubbing shoulders with extremists. The Levelling Up secretary pledged to expose groups trying to subvert democracy and warned that some pro-Palestine events have been organised by extremist organisations. Now, we all know there was a march in London yesterday. There were only 5 arrests, so remarkably peaceful considering how many people were there. But we did, once again, hear those chants, didn't we? Not as many as we have in the past, but from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. So we've heard those chants, which could be deemed offensive. We saw people wearing masks, which they're not meant to do anymore. So is Michael Gove right to say we need to tackle this extremism and introduce new regulations that define what extremism is and also add some new groups to that list? Benjamin, coming to you first on this one.
I think he's absolutely right to say that there have been extremists on these marches. You know, if I went on a march and someone from the BNP was next to me in that, would I go back next Saturday? Probably not. I'd feel very uncomfortable if they were re-invited. And so I think that's a good comparison to what we've seen in these marches. I have no doubt that the vast...
But would you keep going back if you knew?
Well, I wouldn't go in the first place.
Yeah, I'm so discombobulated by upsetting my mum, by the way. Hello, Mum. I still love you. I haven't even introduced my panel. Benjamin Butterworth, obviously, and David Curtin. So thank you so much for joining me. They're also being naughty and irritating any respective mums in their families because they're obviously with me this afternoon. Any case, let's get back to Michael Gove. Love you, Mum.
Hopefully not new laws for TV presenters and just extremists.
Well, I mean, it's like, well, I'm just going to sit here and hold my mum's picture up now because I'm not having lunch with her. So let's get back to Michael Gove. Go on.
So, I think it's absolutely right to say that there has been a problem with extremists at these marches. You know, we have seen people that quite clearly celebrate Hamas, a proscribed terrorist group in this country that murdered Jews and wishes to continuously do so until the state of Israel doesn't exist. And so I think that is a fair point. But in the real world, I think it is far more complex to implement, say, a ban on these protests or cracking down on those extremists who obviously shouldn't be allowed to be there. Because, for example, if you said, as much of the Jewish community feels should be the way, that you should not have these protests because it's making people feel unsafe and unwelcome, which it definitely is, then would that actually stop these protests happening? I think you would just have more riotous protests, more legal problems, more police issues. And I think that's the fine line that Michael Gove has to tread on this issue.
It is a very fine line, David, isn't it? Because on one hand, yes, we are very aware of who the proper extremist organisations, but is there a free speech issue here? Doesn't it depend on what your definition of extremism is? Because on one hand, the Muslim Council of Great Britain could be included in this group of extremist organisations.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, you can ask 10 different people, what does extremism mean? You get 10 different answers. I mean, to me, I think the whole concept of extremism is completely meaningless because it's just used as a weapon to cancel the free speech of people that you don't agree with, or people say, oh, I find that offensive, even though it's completely legal, and then they get labelled as extremist, and then they say, someone comes along like Michael Gove and says, oh, well, these protests should be banned because, or these protests, people shouldn't go to these protests because some people think they're extremist. I mean, I've been called extremist in the past for certain things, which, and I'm not, you know, but I'm not because it's a completely meaningless term. And you need to have the bar of what is legal. So if someone is actually causing harassment, they're harassing someone, they're abusing someone, or they're causing criminal damage, well, those are real objective crimes.
But they're already criminal offences.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Whereas extremism is subjective.
So do we need a new definition? And this also includes the far right. I mean, you know, you mentioned the BNP earlier on. By everyone's definition, they are an example of the far right. But, I mean, you know, for example, Tommy Robinson, is he far right, for example? You know, some of the things, some of the Conservative politicians on the right have said could have them prescribed as far right?
I think intent matters in this because, you know, you're allowed to hold whatever conclusions you've come to politically. But if you are, for example, as Tommy Robinson has done, going outside a mosque or an area where Muslims congregate and defacing the Quran, well, then that is trying to inflame tensions. That is not constructive. Arguably, it's taking away some other people's free speech because they feel threatened. In the case of these protests, the people that have gone there and have celebrated Hamas, like those two women who had the paragliding images on their backs that were convicted.
Who weren't really punished, really.
No, but at least they got to them. And I think we have a big problem that I would say is not necessarily about what Parliament has decided and what Michael Gove says. It's about the police feeling empowered and resourced and supported to actually take on the people who are already breaking existing laws on these marches with hate speech, with celebrating prescribed terrorist organisations. Quite frankly, I think it's a bit rich to talk about changing the law when we're not even implementing the laws that exist.
There is that, and I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, David, but it was interesting. There was a chap arrested and then de-arrested yesterday for holding up a sign stating a fact in this country. Right. It's a fact. Hamas are a terrorist organisation. He was arrested, then de-arrested, it has to be said, and we happened to be standing there holding this sign. There's some debate about what he was actually arrested and de-arrested for, but he was actually taken to task by the police, where others holding from the river to the sea signs weren't.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that he held up a sign saying Hamas are terrorists or something like that, which, you know, is a perfectly valid view, and the British government takes that view, and other people don't. But, you know, then you might say, well, from the river to the sea. Yeah, I mean, I deplore what they did on the 7th of October, but I also deplore what Israel are doing in response to that, the collective punishment of Palestinians in Gaza that has led to the deaths of 30,000 people. And all this discussion, that is what's left out. And the people are actually going onto the streets in London to protest against the slaughter of innocent Palestinian people in Gaza and calling for a ceasefire, you know, against what this government and also the Labour opposition wants. They are not willing to call for a ceasefire and call for...
They.
Well, they should, absolutely, because there is collective punishment of Palestinian people.
Punishment.
Absolutely. Israel has cut off their electricity, they've cut off their water supply, and the 99% of people that have been killed by the IDF since the 7th of October are not Hamas. They're innocent people, and there is collective punishment, and it's absolutely wrong.
I don't accept the figures of 30,000. Clearly, there's been an appalling number of deaths, but I don't take a terrorist organisation providing figures. When ISIS or Al-Qaeda give you figures, we don't report those without questioning them, and neither should we for Hamas in Gaza. And they talk about, as they have for so long, first of all, the narrative was that Gaza was basically a prison because it was having its access cut off by Israel before October 7th, and now they say it was the most wonderful place on earth and Israel came in and ruined it. They say, oh, we don't have enough money for medicine or for food or water, and yet they never run out of money for missiles and for tunnels to attack their neighbour. It is not collective punishment. What Israel is doing is defending itself against its neighbours, which are terrorists and which are anti-Semites with huge amounts of funding from Iran.
Not many of those who have
Unless you condemn what we did in Germany in the Second World War, then I think it is a bit wrong to say that Israel is not acting in self-defence against Gaza and Hamas.
Well, we have to tell you what's happening now, and this is more than self-defence, because they're not just going after the Hamas terrorists or freedom fighters, whatever you call them, on different sides of the argument, but many innocent people have been killed. These figures have been verified and supported by UN agencies as well.
UN agencies that are full of Hamas supporters in that part of the world.
Certainly there are, I would agree with that, 30,000, probably more now, and the vast majority of them are women and children, more than half of them, completely innocent, and that needs to stop. I mean, even Joe Biden has said he doesn't want Israel to go into Rafah, and they're planning an assault on Rafah. Most of the people, the innocent people in Gaza, have been pushed from the north to the south. You've now got most of them, the civilians, stuck in Rafah, near to the border. They're in horrendous situations, much more densely populated than they ever were, and it was bad enough to begin with. And now they're threatening to go in and bomb the people in the places that are supposed to be safe. That's got to stop, because there's a humanitarian disaster there. And people are protesting against that, quite rightly so.
Anybody wants it to stop, and the good news is that there's a really straightforward answer. It's called freeing the hostages, the Jewish men, women and children who were stolen from their homes by terrorists. And quite frankly, I agree, free Palestine. Free Palestine from Hamas, a terrorist group full of people who've raked in billions from international aid across the world to live in the UAE and Qatar while their own people are dying. Nobody gave a damn about them before October 7th, and now they're trying to use it as an excuse to blame Israel when the Arab world has let these people down. It's not just Israel which has put limits on what's getting in and out of Gaza, it's Egypt too. And yet, strangely, we never hear about Egypt, which has a wall on its border with Gaza that even Donald Trump couldn't imagine.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. Hamas should release all the hostages. It's absolutely wrong that they're keeping hostages. That's absolutely appalling. But Israel are killing far, far more people almost every day, every week, than the number of hostages that there are.
One thing I'm curious about, David, 12 years ago, I think it was, a Syrian city with the world's largest Palestinian community was literally razed to the ground by Bashar al-Assad. He laid siege to that city for 5-6 years. It was starvation, it was deprivation, it was illnesses, it was all the things we are seeing in Gaza now. Why weren't there marches in London about that?
You know, that's a very good point. And I think there's about 30 different wars going on all over the world. But the only thing that we hear about in the mainstream media and the media outlets in the UK and around the West is the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Israel-Gaza. We don't hear anything much about what's happening in Kashmir, in Ethiopia, Eritrea, in Sudan, in Burma, all these other places.
There's lots of conflicts we should be hearing about. But this was also Palestinians being wiped out by al-Assad. Why weren't the people that are marching now marching then? Is it something to do with the fact that Israel are involved?
It may be. But it doesn't, you know, stop the horror of what's happening in Gaza at the moment. But yeah, it's a very good question. You know, why weren't people there at that point? That is a very good point. I do agree with that. But we've got to think about what's happening now too.
The answer is pretty straightforward. You know, people hate this when it's the Jews that do it, because there is an anti-Semitism that runs through history, that runs through so many countries in the world. Sadly, there are still many Arab countries which teach their young that the Holocaust never happened. Sadly, there is still a very real anti-Semitism, which is why you see Israel painted as the evil, powerful aggressor, when it is a tiny country of a tiny population that has fought for thousands of years to have a safe place for Jews who have been subject to more genocides than any other racial group.